This is Grace with Graceful Living. Hi, my name is Grace O'Neil. I'm an emergency physician in Hawaii. Today I'm going to go over some things that are kind of circulating around about COVID. We're going to play a little game called COVID Fact or COVID Fiction. Ready to play? Questions are easier in the beginning and they get more difficult in the end. This is the first one. Fact or fiction? Doctors make more money for COVID deaths. Fiction. As an emergency physician, I can tell you that doctors definitely do not make more money when people die of COVID. But don't take it from me. The CDC's chief of mortality statistics, Bob Anderson, stated that people are misinterpreting standard death certificate language. In 94% of deaths with COVID-19, other conditions are listed in addition to COVID-19. They may include chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension. This does not mean that people died from the other conditions and not COVID. It just means that people who suffer from chronic conditions are more likely to die from COVID. How about this one? Instead of preventing the spread from COVID, we should let it spread so we can get herd immunity from COVID. It worked in Sweden, right? This is fiction. This is an article that analyzed Sweden's initial response to the pandemic. As you can see, compared to Sweden's neighbors, there were no borders closed, schools closed, though they did enact distance education. They only banned gatherings greater than 50 after March 27. They never restricted pubs, bars, and restaurants. Essentially, if you look at this table, their restrictions were a lot less than the other neighboring countries. As you can see here, Sweden had a higher death rate and a higher case rate, but a lower testing rate than the neighboring countries. Part of the problem is that authorities predicted that 40% of the people in Stockholm would get the disease and develop protective antibodies. However, that was only around 15% by May. Part of the problem is that severely infected COVID patients acquire antibodies immediately and during early recovery, but antibodies are much less common in only mildly ill or asymptomatic patients. Therefore, because they do not have antibodies, they will not be preventing the spread of the virus and helping herd immunity. This is a study done on 365,000 patients, and it shows that antibodies will decline over time. In this diagram, you see antibodies declining over the course of 2 to 3 months. This happens with other coronaviruses as well that cause the common cold. Next, fact or fiction. Because we are doing more testing, it just looks like more people have COVID. Fiction. Tests will help us determine the true prevalence of COVID and help people who have COVID isolate themselves from others. In the beginning of the pandemic, only the very sickest individuals were able to get tested, causing the share of positive tests out of the total tests to be high. As more tests become available, those with mild or no symptoms who are less likely to actually have COVID are able to get tests, which would lead to a lower positivity rate. We've all heard this one, but is it true? Fact or fiction? Wearing a mask will increase the amount of carbon dioxide that I breathe and cause a low oxygen saturation. This is fiction. Here in this study, they studied both patients with lung disease or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and healthy patients. They looked at lung exchange for VA residents or house staff, 15 of them, and also 15 VA patients with lung disease. They did not find any impairment of gas exchange when wearing a surgical mask, even in those subjects with COPD or severe lung impairment. Okay, let's go on. Fact or fiction? Kids are immune to COVID and cannot get sick from it. This is unfortunately fiction. In this large study on children in China with coronavirus, they found that children can get ill from coronavirus. The study looked at 2,143 cases of children under 18. About half of the children had mild symptoms, like fever, fatigue, cough, congestion, maybe diarrhea or nausea. More than a third became moderately sick with additional symptoms like pneumonia or lung problems on CT scan, but no obvious shortness of breath, and 4% had no symptoms at all. There were 125 children, around 6%, who developed very serious illness. One 14-year-old boy with coronavirus died. As you can see from this table, while most children develop mild or moderate symptoms, a small percentage, especially babies and preschoolers, can become very seriously ill. Here's the next one. Fact or fiction? As long as you stay 6 feet away from other people, you will not get COVID. I kind of addressed this in some of my previous videos. This is unfortunately fiction. In this study, they looked at how COVID droplets and aerosols traveled, mostly indoors. As you can see from this diagram, depending on what people are doing, COVID aerosols and droplets can go a long way, even longer than 2 meters, which is greater than 6 feet. How about this one? Fact or fiction? I do not have to socially distance because I am wearing a mask. This is fiction too. As you can see from this diagram, wearing a mask is protective because there aren't as many droplets and aerosols that are transmitted. However, there are still droplets and aerosols around an infected person, even with the mask. This is another interesting diagram from the same study showing the airflow pattern of an airplane cabin with an infected person. As you can see, when the infected person is not wearing a mask, being 6 feet away from them or having a middle seat unoccupied may not be enough. However, when they are wearing a mask, it is a lot better. However, even with the mask, I probably wouldn't want to be sitting next to a person with COVID. Next one, fact or fiction? Always wear gloves when touching things like Amazon packages because they may carry COVID. I would say this is mostly fiction, but some fact. I would say there is a very small possibility that you could get COVID from an Amazon package. It would be highly unlikely. I also see people wearing gloves in the supermarket. I think they are afraid that someone with COVID might have touched food packaging or any food that they are going to eat. If a person with COVID did touch it, probably there would be a very low viral load on the item unless they sneezed or coughed on the item. They could possibly also infect the item by touching their eye and then touching the package of food. This would be very unlikely to cause COVID, as COVID cannot often survive that long on surfaces. This is a commentary in the Lancet about fomites, or inanimate objects or surfaces that could possibly transmit a virus like COVID, stating that some of the studies done earlier were done by placing a very large initial viral titer sample on the surface being tested. And a lot of these studies do not present scenarios akin to real-life situations. Usually COVID is transmitted by close contact with others. As I see people touching things with their gloves on, and then they touch their phone with their gloves and their own personal belongings with their gloves. If there were fomites on their gloves, they would be transferring the fomites on their gloves to their personal belongings so that they might infect themselves later when they touch their personal belongings. It makes more sense to me to wash your hands frequently and avoid touching your face instead of actually wearing gloves. Here's another one. Fact or fiction? I already had COVID once, so I cannot get it again. This is definitely fiction. There is evidence for people being reinfected. Well, if you've been infected already, the next time you have it, it won't be as bad, right? Well, this is not necessarily true either, because some people who were reinfected again had more severe disease the second time. As more reinfections arise, we will be able to study them and learn more about COVID reinfection. This is the last one, guys. Fact or fiction, the COVID vaccine will be out soon, and soon this will all be over. I'd say it depends on what your definition of soon is. As much as I'd like to say this is a fact, the average vaccine takes about 10 to 12 years to develop. As you can see from this diagram, the development phase includes many things. Some vaccines are currently in phase 3 development in the United States. You may ask, how do China or Russia have vaccines out already? Well, unfortunately, they have decided to not wait for the results of their phase 3 trials. We'll be experimenting on the people getting the vaccine. Phase 3 trials are conducted to confirm and expand on safety and effectiveness results from phase 1 and 2 trials, and to evaluate overall risks and benefits of the vaccine. This is a New York Times article about 3 COVID-19 vaccine trials that were paused for safety concerns. One of the vaccines that was given caused 2 events in volunteers of transverse myelitis. Transverse myelitis causes lower back pain, sharp shooting sensations that radiate down the legs or arms or around the torso, sensory alterations, and can cause paresthesias in the legs and loss of sensation. If we didn't have these phase 3 trials, this could have been administered to a far larger population and caused more problems for more people. Even when the vaccine comes, it will likely not be widely available. It may be offered to certain parts of the population first, like healthcare workers or elderly and more vulnerable people. It may take more than one dose as antibodies wane over time, as we saw in a previous study. Also, some of the poorer countries may not be able to get access to the vaccine right away. Okay, I know this is all very depressing, but there are good things happening, like since we know better how to treat COVID, the death rate seems to be getting better. So for now, I'd recommend continuing good hand hygiene and social distancing and wearing a mask. I hope this video was helpful. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. Please go to graceinhawaii.com for more information.